With us now to break down the diplomatic, security, and economic stakes on this trip to China, former Canadian ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques. Dick Fadden is both a former head of CSIS and national security advisor to Prime Ministers Trudeau and Harper. And CTV News chief financial correspondent Amanda Lang rounds us out this evening. Hello to all three of you. Thank you very much for making the time. Amanda, I will start with you because the premise of this trip, the impetus for it, is very much being conveyed to Canadians around the economy and in trade in particular, and particularly at a time, I should say, when we are kind of suffering at the hands of the United States and collectively realizing we should not be as reliant on them. How would you qualify the opportunity, or maybe lack thereof, that China presents for Canada against that backdrop?
I mean, I would say I would go back to this question of what success looks like. I would say in its simplest form, success would be a removal of punitive tariffs on sectors of our economy. So as we all know, particularly in the ag sector, soybean, pea products, absolute removal of those would be success. The more complicated question around what success looks like is where you get to the merging of the interests that are economic, but then also national security in nature and diplomatic in nature. And that's the complexity that takes longer. Removing those tariffs shouldn't take long. That should actually be step number one, Vashi. And then you can have the conversation about what a closer, more deeply integrated trade relationship might look like.
When we hear the government in particular talk about this, Guy, they are quick to say, you know, we have these concerns around national security. We have other concerns even around China being a trading partner. But we think that there are these areas, as Amanda points out, that you know, there are mutual interests, like areas that we can cooperate on, and it doesn't have to be everything. If you were to isolate for Canadians watching, like where the opportunity in your view lies, do those areas exist, and what are they?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister has to address both security issues and trade issues during this trip. And since it's an official visit, he will have the opportunity to have good discussions with the leaders of China. And on this, it's already a more important economic relationship that our trade data show, because according to the Chinese figures, we exported close to $65 billion worth of products in 2024. According to our own figure, it was just close to 30 billion. And the difference is that the Bank of China, for instance, bought $25 billion worth of gold in 2024. So that means, from my perspective, we already export about 1/10 to China of what we export to the U.S. And China would buy all the oil, all the liquefied natural gas that we could provide. They are still very interested in our agri-food products, in our minerals. And I think in the field of clean energy, in the environment, there are also good opportunities. And we have to remind ourselves that there's a growing middle class that likes a quality product. The Chinese like lobster. So if we could remove the 25% tariff on that, I think this would be most appreciated, as well on pork, where Quebec pork producers would be very happy with the lifting of those tariffs.
Dick, about a decade ago, the conversation was kind of similar to this. There wasn't Trump in the way that we have come to know him as we do right now. Like, we knew him, but not in the same way, but we were talking about opportunities. In the interim, between then and now, the focus of the conversation in Canada has largely been around national security because of the events, of course, of what happened. Officials keep telling us they're going into these talks with eyes wide open when it comes to national security. What do Canadians need to know at this juncture about, you know, the truth of that matter, in your view?
Well, I think Canadians have to know that we're not unique in this respect, that China has very active intelligence programs against most Western countries in the world. So I think that our approach to China has to be driven by pragmatism. China is there, we have to deal with them. I think, on the other hand, we have to be very, very clear that a lot of the practices that have, you know, animated your discussions and others over the course of the last decade or so are not acceptable to Canada. But they're not acceptable to any Western countries, yet we still go on. If I can just make an economic point as well, I think that it would be very good news indeed if the canola tariffs were eliminated or reduced. But China is not going to give us anything for nothing. And I think we're going to have to figure out very, very carefully what we're prepared to give. And in that context, it is impossible to ignore the United States, who have very firm views on the United States and on China, beg your pardon, and also I think have very firm views on how their allies deal with China. So I think Carney and company have a very, very complex job ahead of them. And security is one component. I don't think it should be determinative, but neither do I think that the economic one should be determinative. In the end, an important country like China will want more from us than just buying and selling. We have to find a way to broaden the relationship while I think still being very, very careful about security.
It's a great point, Amanda, about the United States in particular. Even if we look at the kind of myopic issue of the tariffs, those EV tariffs were initially placed on by the previous government to be in alignment with the United States, right? And the United States still takes the position that the EV tariffs are effective and necessary. How would you characterize the economic relationship right now with China and the United States?
I mean, it's in a very interesting state because the U.S., of course, has taken a hard stance on some issues where China is concerned, but in some ways much softened from what the Biden administration was doing. And that goes to issues like the willingness to suddenly sell chips as long as the Trump administration takes a piece of the action. So there's kind of a different protocol, if you will, driving the interests of the administration right now. And it's not totally clear what sort of the thinking is other than their own interest. That does open a door, I think, to Canada to find a way to maneuver this. And what I would say, when I look at the trade data between China and Canada, what really jumps out at you is that we send them a lot of raw materials and we buy a lot more from them of finished goods. And this is a moment in our history where we're thinking hard about whether we want to be that player forever and whether we shouldn't actually think about what we can send them in the way of finished goods, how we can change the relationship in a longer term strategic way. It doesn't need to offend the U.S. Do we need to invite electric vehicles from China into Canada? Maybe, maybe not. But maybe there's some middle ground where we actually grow up a little bit beyond just being a raw material producer and think about sort of manufacturing goods and services for China.
Guy, I wanted to lean on your expertise as a long-time diplomat, because we did see something materialize today when it comes to sort of weaving through all of this diplomatically, and that is with Taiwan, right? China, of course, has a very specific position on Taiwan. Canada does not share that position officially. We had a delegation that was in China, including 2 Liberal MPs who decided to come home early because their presence there would have essentially been problematic for whatever message the Prime Minister is trying to deliver in China. The Conservatives who remain in Taiwan essentially say that's cowering to China, to an authoritarian government in China. What is your view on how that could be an example of how difficult this thing is going to be to navigate diplomatically?
Well, I think that was the right decision. It would have been difficult for the Prime Minister to explain the presence of Liberal MPs in Taipei while he was in Beijing, and I think you just have to remove as many potential problems at this stage to set the table to have more meaningful discussion. This being said, we need to continue to have contacts with Taiwan, to send a delegation there to business people, because it's a country, in fact, where it is easier to do business than in China. And I think that the Prime Minister will want to address Taiwan when he meets with the Chinese leader. He will want to impress on them the importance of maintaining the status quo. Otherwise, there could be very difficult consequences for China, including sanctions.
Dick, the final word to you. As Canadians listen to this conversation and think about all the national securities that you and I have spoken about so frequently over the last number of years, and they may be asking themselves, like, is there a way to do what we just outlined and still preserve our national security, vis-a-vis China? What is do you believe the ability exists, A, and B, how do you get there?
Yeah, I think the ability exists, and if it didn't exist, we would have to create it. We are either going to develop the capacity to protect our sovereignty in collaboration with our allies, or we're going to lose that sovereignty. I think we have to be very, very clear with China what we're prepared to put up with and what we're not prepared to put up with. And I think one of the difficulties we've had with the previous administration, with Mr. Trudeau's government, is that we had a whole raft of issues and difficulties with China, and we didn't want to talk about it. I think we have to be more upfront publicly and make sure that both the Canadian population and China understands that. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to disagree with Guy on a small point. I think it was a mistake for those two MPs to leave Taiwan. We have a one China policy. And whatever we can say about the Chinese, they are not stupid. They understand it perfectly well. And I think they know well that MPs and officials and members of the media visit Taiwan all the time. And we're removing them, I think, risks giving the impression that we're a little bit scared about the upcoming meeting with the Prime Minister. So while Guy is a much bigger, better diplomat than I am, I would argue in this case, it would have been better for them to stay and for the Prime Minister to simply say it's consistent with the policy that we've had for the last decade.
I'm going to leave it on that note. We welcome all views on this show. Thanks for sharing yours tonight, everybody. Thanks for your analysis. I appreciate it very much. Amanda Lang, Guy Saint-Jacques, and Richard Fadden.